A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to our respected lecturer, Professor Dr. Hairuddin bin Muhammad Ali, and our fellow friends. Today is our Group 5 turn to present Chapter 7, External Environments of School. I would like to introduce Group 5 presenter. The first one is me, Rohani binti Abdul Syukur. Second presenter is Salmah binti Sabtu. The third presenter is Sabaria binti Rasim. The fourth one is Nur Elina binti Nasruddin. And the last presenter is Muhammad Zawawi bin Smart. Content of this presentation are: first, task and institutional environment; second, information perspective which include environmental uncertainty; thirdly, resource dependence perspective including administering information and resources environment; internet coping strategies and inter-organizational coping strategies; fourth, institutional perspective that have four subtopics as conceptual foundation, summary assessment of institutional theory, administering institutional environments, and policy making and the changing environments for education. Objectives of this presentation are to understand the existing task and institutional environmental influence, to explain information perspective about environmental uncertainty. The third one, to differentiate resource dependence perspectives between internal coping strategies and inter-organizational coping strategies. The fourth one, to understand institutional perspective about conceptual foundation, summary assessment of institutional theory, administering institutional environments and policy making and the changing environments for education. As we know, schools are open systems and depend on exchange with environmental elements to survive. Multiple environmental influences come from different levels of society and affect what happens in schools. Two general perspectives of environment are the task perspective and the institutional perspective. From this diagram, multiple environmental influences come from different levels of society and affect what happens in schools. Technological and informational development, political structures and patterns of legal norms, social conditions and cultural values, economic and market factors, and population and demographic characteristics influence school structure and processes. Within a specific locality, myriad stakeholder groups play key roles in affecting educational practice. For example, individual parents, taxpayer associations, business groups, legislature, and accrediting agencies influence school policy. We will go through the first topic, task and institutional environment. According to William R. Deal, 1958, task environment, which includes all aspects of environment that may potentially influence goal setting and achievement, is a useful concept in understanding external influences on school organizations. The basic premise of task environments is that organizations are created to perform some function of work in society and to achieve goals. Features in task environments emphasize that organizations such as schools are productive systems. They convert input into output. Effective school administrators then design efficient work requirements, coordinate technical processes, and ensure adequate resource providers and markets for school output. Scott, 2003. The task perspective includes both the information and the resource dependency theories. The institutional perspective offers an alternative approach to understanding external environment. Now, we will go through information perspective. In the information perspective, the external environment is a source of information, for example, about expected goals and levels of performance. that decision makers use in maintaining or changing the internal structures and processes of their organization. In this framework, the external environment is defined as information about external factors as perceived by organizational participants. What is environmental uncertainty? A primary concern of the information perspective is uncertainty. Environmental uncertainty exists when decision makers in an organization are unable to make accurate predictions because existing conditions in the external environment prevent them from having adequate information. The information framework focuses on decision makers' perceptions of their environments and how they use the information to adjust the internal structures and processes of their organization. For example, when organizations confront uncertain environments, they are often able to maintain or increase their effectiveness through additional flexibility in or redesign of their structure configuration. The information perspective emphasizes goal achievement based on perceptions of the external environment as the primary sources of information about that schools are expected to produce for society. Based on their perceptions, school administrators then lead efforts to change their school organization.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. I am Salma binti Sabtu. I would like to present the topic of resource dependence perspective. In contrast to the information perspective, the resource dependence perspective views the environment as a place to gain scarce resources for the tasks and technical process of the organization. Four general types of environmental resources are typically identified as physical, personal, information and knowledge, and product and services. Environmental resources are commonly conceptualized on a continuum of scarcity to magnificence. That is, the extent or capacity of the environment to provide resources that support the stability and sustained growth of the organization. For example, school districts in wealthy environments might have high property evaluations that produce relatively large tax revenues with small tax levies. Other examples, school districts in impoverished environments would be limited to a basic academic curriculum and extracurricular program would compete for what might be left over. Dependence is defined both by the extent of need for a resource and its availability in the environment. For educational settings, dependence is directly related to school organizations' need for resources controlled by other organizations, and inversely related to the resource availability from other organizations. As the primary proponent of resource-dependent theory, Jeffrey Pfeffer asserts that its fundamental proposition is that if organizations are unable internally to generate the resource to maintain themselves, they must enter into exchange with environmental elements to acquire the needed resources. For example, individuals who have been educated and trained in the school contribute their effort to society, and society demands that schools offer particular types of educational program. The challenge for school decision makers is to determine the extent to which their schools can and must adapt to various environmental demands and the implication of those responses for their organizations. In sum, from the resource dependence framework, school organizations view the external environment as providing a variety of resources for their task structures and process in exchange for products and services valued in the external environment. As schools become more dependent on their environments, internal control is reduced and external constraints are imposed. As a result, schools adapt by becoming more flexible and less bureaucratic. For the topic, Administrating Information and Resource Environment. Educational administrators often try to minimize external efforts and assume key roles in managing the external environments for their schools. Employing a variety of tactics, educators strive to gain control over resources to avoid becoming dependent, to make others dependent on them, and to absorb uncertainty. Attempts to reduce environmental uncertainty and dependence can be grouped into internal or inter-organizational coping strategy. Both set of strategies are designed to protect key process from environmental influence by increasing certainty and gaining additional resources. Internal coping strategies. Internal coping strategies are designed to protect key processes from environmental influence by increasing certainty and gaining additional resources. There are two major strategies in internal coping strategies. The first one is buffering and the second one is adjusting internal operation. Buffering. According to Monty Elling, define buffering as the regulation and or insulation of organizational process, functions, entities, or individuals from the effects of environmental uncertainty or scarcity. This is a strategy of isolation based on the assumption that efficiency can be maximized only when the technical core, for example, teaching in school, is not disturbed by external uncertainties and dependencies. Stated simply, buffering creates a protective layer between the organization and its environments. Principals play key buffering roles in dealing with parental complaints about teachers and in protecting the school and themselves from threats in the community. Other common buffering strategies include planning and forecasting and spanning organizational boundaries, strategies widely applicable to school organization. For planning and forecasting, buffer organization by anticipating environmental changes and taking action to soften their adverse effect on individuals and on internal structures and process. Educational planners are expected to identify the important environmental element and to analyze potential action and counteraction by other organizations. Planning must be extensive and forecast a variety of scenarios. For boundary spanning, creates internal roles to cross organizational boundaries and to link schools with elements in the external environment. Two classes of function are typically performed of boundary spanning roles. Are detecting information about changes in the external environment and representing the organization to the environment. For the detection function, boundary roles concentrate on the transfer of information between the environment and schools. Boundary personnel scan and monitor events in the environment that can create abrupt changes and long-term trends and communicate the information to decision maker. For representation function, boundary spanning personnel send information into the environment from the organization. The idea is to influence other people's perception of the organization, reduce uncertainty, and hence buffer its operating score. Schools often have officers of public information whose express purpose is to communicate information to significant stakeholders. The second strategies are adjusting internal operation. The information and resources dependent perspective suggests a structural contingency approach to organizational design. According to Burns and Stoker, when the external environment was stable, the internal organization was mechanistic or highly bureaucratic, that is characterized by formal rules and regulation, standard operating procedure, and centralized decision-making. Interpersonal relationships were formal, impersonal, rigid, and clear-cut. In highly uncertain environments, the internal organization was organic or informal, that is, it exhibited few rules, informal agreements about operating procedures, and decentralized decision-making. Interpersonal relations were informal, personal, flexible, and somewhat ambiguous. According to resource dependence theory, the environment does not impose strict requirements for survival. Internal power differences are important because no single optimal structure or set of action aligns the organization with its environment. Instead, a range of choice strategies of alignment are available. The influence of a variety of internal stakeholders may determine, in interaction with the demands of external constituencies, the response of the organization.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Sabaria binti Rasing. I will continue this presentation with the topic Inter-Organizational Coping Strategies. For this topic, I will focus on two types of strategies to manage the external aspect of school environment. The first strategy is establishing favorable linkages, and secondly is shaping environmental elements as shown by the diagram in the slide. For the first strategy, which is establishing favorable linkages, this strategy to gain additional control over their information and resource environments. Non-profit organizations, such as public schools, have been actively increasing the number of alliances, partnerships, and collaborations with other organizations. Inter-organizational linkages are important because they increase organizational power, reduce uncertainty, increase performance by ensuring a stable flow of critical resources, and protect the organization from adverse effects of environmental uncertainty and scarcity. There are various approaches in creating and strengthening relationships among the organizations. For example, expanding or increase the number of alliances, establishing a partnership and collaborations with other organizations. These organizations work together to address problems through cooperative efforts, resources, and decision-making, and share ownership of the final products and service. In business organizations, a popular mechanism to reduce competition and dependence is to merger. Although occasional organizations cannot rely on mergers, they do enter into joint ventures with other organizations. School districts form partnership, collaborative, or coalitions with businesses, foundations, universities, and federal and state governments to share the risks and costs associated with large-scale innovations and research projects. The another strategy is cooptation. Cooptations mean bringing leaders from important elements in the environment into the policy and decision structures of the school organizations. Cooptations occurs when influential citizens are appointed to boards of education or to advisory committees. Let's focus on the second strategy, that is shaping elements in the policy-making environments. According to Kingdon, 1995, there are two layers of policy-making that are inside government and outside government. Within inside governments, three groups control the policy process: elected office holders and their appointees in the executive branch, civil servants, and legislators and their staff. Within outside government, four types of groups are influential: interest groups, collections of individuals, for example, academics, researchers, and consultants, and then the media and election-related participants. While no policy actor dominates policy processes, elected officials in the executive and legislative branches and their appointees are generally the most influential. To offset the power of government representative in shaping external environments, educators and other outsiders expanding the political missions, especially among the educational organizations or interest groups. The educational organizations or interest group can afford to pay people to carry out activities such as lobbying legislators, influencing new or modifying existing regulations, promoting educational programs, and presenting public relations campaigns. The following tables can summarize 12 types of influence tactics of interest groups. Using this tactic with the intent of influencing public policy is lobbying. Modern information technologies such as email, internet search engines and websites, and computerized fax machines enhance both the urgency and pervasiveness of these influence efforts. Education interest groups at both the state and national levels employ a wide array of these strategies.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Noor Elina binti Rasudin and I will present about institutional perspective. Although the important element of task environment for organization are material and resource-based, the primary factors in institutional environment are symbolic and textual in nature, according to Scott 2003. Moreover, the institutional perspective has become a leading approach to understanding organizations and their environment, according to Ms. Ritchie in Payne 1999. Institutions can be formal organizations, but they do not have to be. Some institutions are based on formal written codes of conduct, that is, law, constitutions, standard operating procedures, and so forth. They are enforced by the coercive power of social agencies. Other institutions endure less formally as norms and values, that is, as strongly felt obligations that have been internalized through socialization. The institutional environment, therefore, is characterized by elaborate rules and requirements to which individual organizations must conform if they are to receive support and legitimacy. In modern societies, the environmental requirements, for example, rules, norms, values, and ideologies, are rational informed, with the chief sources of rationalization being government and professions. In fact, rationalized mythos yang rational, commonly used in discussion institutions and their environment. Mythos are widely held beliefs that cannot be or typical and not objective tested. They are true because they are beliefs. Myths become rationalized when they take the form of bureaucratic or professional rules, specifying procedure necessary to accomplish are given, and according to Scott 1992, rationalized mythos yang rational. Then are rules specifying procedures to accomplish an outcome on the basis of beliefs they assume to be true or be taken for granted. Next, conceptual foundation. What is conceptual foundation? Institutional theory is similar to task environmental theories. Both institutional and task environment theories focus on organization environment relation rather than on internal influence. Hence, task and institutional environment should not be viewed as mutually exclusive factors because they coexist. In other words, technical and institutional factors are not dichotomous but instead are separate dimensions or continuum along which environment can vary. Next, conformity and institutional environments. Institutional theory emphasizes that organizations are open systems which are strongly influenced by their environments. Accordingly, organizations conform to institutionalized rules and procedures to gain legitimacy, that is, to secure cultural support for the organization. In other words, institutional conformity promotes the apparent success and long-term survival of the organization, independent of any effects that conformity might have on technical productivity. Next, coercive conformity stems from political influence and problem of legitimacy. Coercive conformity results when organizations follow the rules and regulations promulgated by government agency and thereby produce similar structure or process, according to Rowan and Miskell. Common and visible pressures or policy instruments for school change include government mandates and inducement on the basis of both federal and state regulation, for example, like Malaysia and Selangor, KPM and Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri. For example, school now hire special education teachers to serve special needs children, anak-anak yang kurang upaya, sekolah berkeperluan khas. School now hire special education teachers to develop curriculum materials to meet standards of framework and give student achievement tests that conform to government standards. Okay, next, imitative conformity may result from adopting standard responses from other sources to reduce uncertainty. In other words, when organizations such as school have big ideologies and ambiguous goals, they may model themselves on other organizations that they perceive to be more legitimate and successfully. A school adopt a new structure to enhance efficiency. If the new structure is perceived to improve performance, others may copy it. Over time, school may adopt the new structure not for the technical purpose of the improving efficiency, but for the institutional purpose of gaining legitimacy, which is constituent by mimicry of successful organization. Next, normative conformity means arises when personnel have been socialized and educated to follow professional standards, spread professional codes across organization according to Rowan and Miskin 1999. Two aspects of professionalism are particularly important in produce conformity in school organization. The first rests on formal education and cognitive knowledge. Professionals learn the standard methods of practice and normative rules about appropriate behavior. The second comes from the growth and elaborate of professional network and institutions that span organization and allow new models to diffuse rapidly. Next, educational diversity and multiple institutional environment. While there are strong environmental pressures for conformity, considerable diversity is also evident within the larger K-12 educational sector. In contrast to highly centralized national system in many countries, for example, in America, the institutional environment of American schools are complex and vary and have many layers. For example, a distinctive characteristic of American education is very centralized funding and control at state and local level. Many policy makers, citizens, parents, scholars, and educators probably have not recognized and taken seriously the diversity of K-12 educational sector. When considering K-12 education in the United States, they see primarily the pervasive public school system, yet well-developed subsectors of non-profit and for-profit private, vocational, daycare, and alternative approaches also coexist with or within the public subsector of K-12 education. In fact, the persistent and increasing private child alternative school and voucher plans may signal. Next, stability and institutional environments. There isn't centralized government, professional associations, and coalitions among organizations provide for standardized operative procedures and stability. Environmental demands, characteristic of school inputs and outputs, and technical process are brought under the jurisdiction of institutional meaning and control. That's it from me. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum and good day everyone. My name is Muhammad Zawawi bin Seman and I will present to you about administering institutional environments. Scott 1992 indicates that there are clear differences in the way organizations respond to technical and institutional aspects of the environment. Most links with technical environment involve exchanges of information and resources. Although some ties to institutional environments involve exchanges, especially information, the institutional perspective postulates that organizations are constituted by elements drawn from their environments. So, for the first point is buffering strategies. Recall from our earlier discussions that buffers are structures and processes that insulate or surround internal activities and absorb environmental disturbances. Buffering essentially creates a protective layer between the organization and its environment. A major problem to resolve by buffering mechanisms is conflicts between pressures for technical efficiency and institutional rules. From an institutional perspective, decoupling and managing the image are two ways to buffer school organization from their environments. Moving to managing the image, this strategy involves impression management to portray structures and action in ways that garner endorsement. Impression management makes extensive use of symbolic categories and coding rules. Similar to cognitive schema, symbolic categories are created to select, identify, classify, and label the things or people being possessed by the organization. Coding rules are essence of institutional frameworks. They provide the distinction among things and people that allow standard operating or taken for granted procedures to be employed. Meyer and Rowan, for instance, state that using cost analysis to justify school projects is an institutional norm that can provide a rationale if a project fails. Secondly, boundary spanning strategies. Earlier in this chapter, boundary spanning or bridging was defined as activities that create internal rules to cross organizational boundaries and link the school organization with elements in the external environment. This topic was separated to 3 points, which is firstly, categorical conformity. Categorical conformity is basically a process whereby institutional rules become distinctions that are taken for granted and provide organization with a basis to pattern their structures. These distinctions are examples of widely shared cognitive schema. The cognitive structure become built into our language and generally believed. Meyer and Rowan, 1978, refer to this as a system of ritual categories. This system has elaborate rules for classifying teachers. For example, elementary or secondary, and each category has its own specification and credential. Second, structural conformity. Sometimes institutional environments impose very specific structural requirements on school as a condition of acceptance and support. External mandates cause schools to implement new programs. In the past 3 decades, many special education programs, for example, programs for those who are mildly learning disabled to severely and profoundly retarded, and for those who have hearing, visual, and other impairments, have been incorporated into educational organizations to meet various legislative laws, administrative rules, and parental beliefs. Using various arrangements, schools have developed structures to conform to the special need categories designed in the institutional environments. Lastly, procedural conformity. Meyer and Rowan, 1977, observed that despite the lack of coordination and control of technical activities, schools are not anarchized. Day-to-day activities occur in an orderly fashion. In fact, institutional environments pressure schools' procedural conformity. Carrying out activities in specific ways, school organization can respond with rational myths that detail the steps to be followed in carrying out certain types of procedures. So, for the second slide, it is about the policy making and the changing environments for education. Systemic reform is a comprehensive change program designed to modify schools in an integrated, coordinated, and coherent fashion to achieve clearly stated educational outcomes. The basic priority of systemic reform is to define ambitious curriculum content and achievement standard in core academic subjects and to tightly couple the goals with an assessment program. The alignment of curriculum content and achievement standard with assessment procedures create an accountability system for monitoring the efficiency and effectiveness of K-12 schools. For the perspective of environmental theory, a likely result of systemic reform of K-12 education is to increase the influence to task and decrease the influence of institutional environments. As Ogawa's findings with school-based management and standard-based curriculum indicate, a crucial point in systemic reform is whether the current initiative promotes technical efficiency and effectiveness of social arguments, further governmental standardization, and professional control. If the goals of systemic reforms are to be achieved, technical environments must be the dominant form for school and tight linkages must develop for accountability, efficiency, and effectiveness. If the switch to technical environments does not occur, the systemic reform efforts may produce a new, thicker web of rationalized myths and further institutionalize the environment of public K-12 education. Alternatively, further reliance on rationalized myths in the face of intense public calls for reform, might force a break in the near monopoly of public education and produce competitive market for K-12 education. As is the case with systemic reform, the rationale for competitive market strategies is to place technical environments ahead of institutional environments. Competitive market supporters are hypothesizing that parents and students will choose schools with ambitious academic goals, excellent teachers and administrators, motivating instructional materials, high efficiency and effectiveness, and strong accountability system. Even if market-driven schools are established on a relatively widespread basis, however, forces in the institutional environment will likely counter the drive to enhance the technical environment. For example, market-driven schools already evidence initiative conformity, and they will likely develop their own rationalized myth, operate in environments institutionalized by government agencies and professional associations, and be strongly resisted by the current holders of the K-12 education monopoly. In sum, we agree with Rowan and Miskel's 1999 conclusion. Concerted institution building over the past 3 decades by professional associations, government agencies and private sector organizations is increasing the intensity of technical environment for schooling. This enhanced technical environment includes a model of educational productivity and technical capacity to inspect educational outcomes of schools. Consequently, schools are facing stronger demands for technical performance than they have in the past, but without also encountering a decline in demands of institutional conformity. Hence, shifting the environment from primarily institutional to both institutional and technical represents fundamental change and will likely have profound effects on how schools operate. And I think that's all from us. Thank you.
This is a list of references we use. That's all from us. Thank you.